No, they're gonna.
All right. Well, welcome everyone to session number 5 of Green New Deal for Portland. Today we're going to talk about organizing and building power. There are 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8 of us in person, probably a couple more will wander in. Nice to see the names of folks online. We are missing Meg today, so maybe, well, Maria's here and online. Maria, can you like monitor the chat? Okay, so Maria's gonna monitor the chat for questions. I am gonna start by sharing my screen and talking a little bit about organizing. And then when Damon Motz-Storey gets here, I think we'll plug them in to talk about the Portland Clean Energy Fund. So let's see. I need promote Maria to panelist. And need to share my screen, which I've done a million times before, but finding it difficult to find where that is right now. Am I losing my mind? Can somebody say, no one want to help me see if I can do screen share? Yeah, right in front of me, literally. Thank you. I am losing my mind. Much appreciated. That's very kind of you to say that. I think it might be something else going on, but right place. Oh, look at that. We are fine. We don't have to do this. Damon's here.
Oh my God.
Yeah, Damon, why don't you
That was part of the bargain.
why don't you grab a slice and come into the space, not rushed, and then I'll talk for a little bit and then we'll pass to you in like
Lovely.
20 minutes or something like that.
Lovely. Sounds good. Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay, folks. So there's going to be a lot of storytelling today, and the main sort of story that we're going to talk about is the Portland Clean Energy Fund organizing campaign, which was really excited. It created this institution that we've talked about a lot in this course, and you know, has been under attack too because it's taxing people and putting money into a fund to give to people that don't have as much money, and that's controversial in this world. So yeah, we're going to talk about how it came to be, like how did Portland create a little mini Green New Deal. It's a great story. Before we dig into storytelling, I'm going to talk a little bit about just like thinking about movement strategy from like a conceptual level and how to, you know, basically put a little like structure, I guess, around anybody who's ever had an idea about they wanted to change something but didn't really know how to get started. And so there are really simple tools that you can use to start campaigning on basically anything. The same types of tools will work. So yeah, and feel free, you can like sit down and enjoy yourself and everything. Yeah.
Cool.
So we're going to talk a little bit about just like theories of change today. We'll talk about how to launch a campaign, how to set objectives, and then basically some tools for how to create a campaign and make it happen. So, you know, basically the first question is, why would you want to start a campaign in the first place? Well, I mean, for me, from my, you know, what I learned over the course of my life so far is that beliefs, attitudes, dreams about the way that things should be are very important, but that doesn't really, those things in and of themselves don't change the material reality around us and make those things happen. And things are often bad, not because of like natural law, but because they're designed by other people to work in certain ways. And then those have benefits for some and harms for others. And so if you want to try to change those things, there's inherent conflict about that because systems have been structured. So, you know, campaigning basically is like the way that you can start thinking about how to change these things. Things that you want to do at first is figure out what your trajectory is, what your goals are, always really important. And you can set lots of different levels of goals. You can, as a movement or a campaign, as like a fledgling movement, it's always good to set goals that are achievable because nothing is better for group cohesion than getting wins. I've seen it a lot of times before where, especially people who haven't organized before and don't have the experience of being able to sort of collectively demand something and get what they want. If you don't reach that, there can be a lot of like infighting and people can get really frustrated and things like that, but there's no greater shortcut to creating group cohesion than winning, honestly. And so when I do campaigning, sometimes I'll set like immediate sort of like short-term goals and things that you can meet to get things going. There's a lot of coalition building. Coalition is a term of art. It depends on who you're talking to. Some people don't like that word as much. I'm using it very loosely, but you want to like, it's hard to do something by yourself unless you're extremely rich or like, uniquely charismatic, I guess, but even then it's pretty hard. And so you need groups of people. And when you're trying to solve a problem, different people may have different interests. And so figuring out how to organize yourselves around like common pieces of a struggle is really important. And when you're doing that, focusing on agreements earlier rather than later can be very important to figure out how you want to work with other people. If people have bright lines that they don't want to be crossed in terms of like how to socialize with one another and how to agree, it's much easier to like talk about those things earlier than to have those boundaries crossed and then deal with conflict sort of like while you're already in struggle against powerful forces trying to change the thing you're trying to change. And that's, I think, something that organizers learned over time because that experience is very difficult. And then for me, I'm a Virgo, I guess. So like the like written components of these sorts of things where you like organize in like a visual way, like a document that sort of talks about what you want to do is something that you can basically always come back to. And I'll basically talk to you a little bit about how to do that. And then we won't do a full communications training tonight, but communication is extremely important in the world that we live in. So, having a communication plan is also really important. So setting objectives, there are lots of different tools that you can use. This is a tool called SMARTY, the acronym for specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, time-bound, inclusive, and equitable. There are other frameworks that you can use. SMARTY is pretty nice, but when you're setting goals, you can check them against basically like these criteria. If you are, let's say you're trying to get part of a neighborhood rezoned or something like that, you could basically like take a goal like that and put it into a framework like SMARTY to be like, okay, is it specific? Yes. Is it measurable? Yes, right? Like the maps are going to change and material changes that place will happen. Is it attainable? Probably. If there's a process that allows you to do it, it's at least, theoretically possible. Is it relevant? Well, if people care about it, it's relevant. Is it time bound? Probably. There's a process around it, right? Anyway, you could go through these things and like check your goals against them. And then when you're setting your goals for your like sort of like longer to medium goals, there are basically you can create timelines or not timelines, events that show you whether you're being successful at meeting your goals or not. And depending on the complexity of what you're actually trying to do, there are different ways of thinking about this. So you will not be able to see this in person, but there's a little graphic that says, where will you intervene? And there are 5 options: a point of production, point of consumption, point of destruction, point of decision, and point of assumption. And basically, these are like for basically like an environmental action is this way of thinking about this. So point of production might be like a factory where like a toxic product is produced, or a coal pit or something like that, right? Coal mine. Point of consumption is usually at the store, right? Like when people are like spending money and exchanging for a commodity. Point of destruction, that can basically be like where materials are disposed of. So like e-waste or something like that, that could be a point of destruction. Point of decision, government bodies, sometimes shareholder meetings, things like that. And then point of assumption is kind of like more about dealing with people at the like level of cognition and how they think about things and challenging deeply held beliefs. And these are all terrains in which your campaign can intervene. a good campaign is probably going to touch on multiple pieces of these, or is going to arrange their goals in such a way that they can hit on some of these things. So let's say we want to stop oil trains or something like that. Maybe part of the way to get to that ultimate goal is to get people to understand that an oil train is a thing that you may not want driving next to your home, for example. You have to convince people to take something that they may have seen as kind of benign and like an everyday feature of the environment that they live in, and be like, hey, that explodes, it could turn over, it's containing things that once they're combusted are harmful to the earth, to get people to appreciate that thing is actually of a different nature than they may have passively understood it to be. So yeah, changing beliefs and attitudes. We talked about this in past sessions, is basically critical to all of these sorts of things. But the more elaborate your goal is, the more basically like you'll have to build on these things in order to get there. And then once you start setting your goals, you get to choose how you want to achieve those. Has anybody ever been involved in campaign design or like done any kind of campaigning before? Yeah. What did you do? What kind of tactics did you use to achieve your goal?
Well, we're still like in the process of it, but right now it's just like researching and stuff.
Okay.
So,
but that's an important tactic, right? Like
yeah,
at the beginning stages, like doing research and figuring out what's going on. If you don't do that, then, it's going to be hard to set goals that are reasonable. Anybody else done a campaign before where they had to like use tactics? Yep.
Yeah, I was part of a group that targeted different banks, like in the Netherlands, and yeah, I moved from basically bank to bank every single month, and did a lot of mostly direct action, so not as like negotiating with public offices or anything, but yeah, just actually regular taking to the streets in mass, and like civil disobedience. Yeah, so.
Great. And how did you, so on the way, how do you do that? How do you get people to do civil disobedience? What kinds of things do you have to do in order to get there?
I guess, yeah, first there was sort of moving to like a critical mass, or like a number of people that was big enough to make it like a safe tactic. And also, yeah, a lot of legal trainings of people's like rights, making sure that the types of direct actions were like creating like harmless enough yeah, like records for people that a lot of people would join. And then, yeah, just a lot of actually like public art and things like this as well, to sort of spread awareness of like what the banks were doing with people's money.
Yeah. So when you first described it, it was sort of like, oh, we're doing direct action. But then when you start breaking it down, there's actually really elaborate, right? There's a lot that has to go. There's a lot of planning that goes into it. Some of it is like just art and communication. Some of it is like social space design of like, you can be here and this is going to like give you certain risk level. And if you're over here, you're going to have like a lower risk level, et cetera, et cetera. You have to arrange people to like help you get out of jail if you run into things. So tactics, they build off one another, but just examples of tactics you might use in a campaign are, you can do media stunts, which is basically just a way of saying like, you're not getting enough attention on your campaign and the press maybe doesn't want to cover it just because you think it's important, and you're trying to like do all the ways of reasoning this through print and it's just not catching on. And so you got to do something a little bit more eye-catching in order to get people to pay attention. And the press loves it when they think somebody might get arrested and the cops are going to show up. And so sometimes that's like an easy way to like generate press, for example, or a banner drop. Has anybody ever done a banner drop before or know what that is? It's like you literally just like take a banner and like unfurl it over a ledge of some kind in a prominent public place. And yeah, I mean, it seems kind of simple, but it does really get people's attention. People in public space don't like it and they try to stop you from doing it and stuff. You can announce a press conference, which is a pretty easy way to say like a bunch of people are going to show up at this space at this time. And sometimes you can get press to come. Public sign-on letters, especially with like prominent leaders or notable people. protests and rallies, public testimony, writing letters to decision makers, or if you're trying to, take away somebody's social license to operate, writing letters to people that are in their kind of like social sphere, letters to the editor, civil disobedience, and then stuff like lobbying and working with kind of like that on the inside part of governance, where you're engaging with decision makers kind of with their rules and the way that they want to be taken. You could also add law and lawsuits to that as well if you wanted to. So basically there's a lot that you can do. Here's the Virgo part. So, and I'll share this out later, but this is just a really good exercise to do with other people when you're coming up with a campaign, is just to arrange basically all of the things that you would need for a campaign. So resources, your objectives, who are you working with? Who would you like to be working with, but you're currently not working with? Who knows the people that you would like to be working with, but you're not there, and it's going to take on the task of like reaching out to people, putting down on paper what your strategies are for achieving those goals. And things get really chaotic sometimes in campaigning, especially when you get to stages where you're like pushing buttons and you're sort of losing control of maybe being able to set the terms of engagement all the time. And so having these things written down and accessible is something that when things are getting chaotic, if there's tension, you can always come back to as a group and sort of see like, oh yeah, this is what we decided together. Does this still make sense? Is it working? Are we staying consistent with these things? Maybe if things aren't working, maybe we've gone off script a little bit. And it's like a way to basically like negotiate that sort of like where you're at and next steps. You can always change and add strategies too. But for me, I guess as like a list type person, this makes a lot of sense. There's also I think this is like one of the most fun things to do in groups of people. And if we had more class periods, maybe it would be fun to even do this as a big group of people. But like when you're doing campaign, like doing an exercise around power mapping can be really, really interesting and useful. And oftentimes you will find out that you have social assets and resources that you didn't previously think that you did, just by basically throwing kind of like everything that you know about the people that are in your social environment who are involved in the campaign in any way. Like, are they the people that you need to convince who are decision makers? Are they people who have money that can put in? Are they people that can impede you from doing what you want or have a different interest that you do? And so basically what you do in power mapping is you just start like arranging these interests on a grid of, and for folks who can't see, the top it says most influential or powerful in terms of your objective. On the bottom, least influential. And on the other axis, strongly support or strongly oppose. And it's very simple. Sometimes life is more complicated than 2 dimensions, but for purposes of strategy, just like listing. So like, let's say that we're aiming at a city council that does not exist in the same way that it used to, because Commissioner Hardesty is not on it anymore. And now I would do this much differently. But let's say that we are doing basically any kind of climate campaign in the year 2021. And we've got, for me, I put up on here three names. The Portland Business Alliance is powerful and opposes us pretty much in everything. So they go on this section, right? And there's Commissioner Maps, who's like, at this point was kind of presenting himself as like a kind of like a centrist or a moderate figure, probably not with us, but like maybe we could move that person. So like put an arrow. And then Commissioner Hardesty, who is like a very strong supporter of all forms of climate action. And so would consider that person to be like a strong supporter, right? And so basically you arrange all of the interests that you can think of that might be relevant. Sometimes you'll think of things that, you know, like just going through the exercise, you'll come up with stuff that you might not have otherwise thought about. And that's something that you can also return to. It can inform your theories of change and your strategies. So I put these down as kind of like a descending list, but they actually do kind of feed off one another, and you can use certain tools to come back to the rest. So once you have, basically like you've started campaigning. There are many different kinds of campaigns. Not all of them are sort of like on timelines that are predictable. Some of them are like very long and last infinitely, in some cases, and you don't have control of the outcomes. If you're dealing with anything that is like a formal process, whether it's legal or administrative, there's almost always going to be some kind of like calendar where like once you start initiating things, or like if a company's trying to get a permit, they've initiated trying to get something, there's going to be a clock. And that clock is like a tool then that you can always work with. And one simple way to think about the time dynamics there is that you want to be at your strongest and your most influential basically right before the decision is going to be made, right? Because that's when you want to have as many people speaking, you want as much press attention, you want, if you're doing things that are like highly visual in the community, you want those things to be happening, because no matter what anybody says about the like insularity or the protected kind of like administrative nature of these decisions, like they are always influenced by the public, no matter how much the sort of like discussion is about like not being influenced, even in the law. They always say, oh yeah, lawyers are just going to like make decisions according to the facts and laws. Like everybody's always influenced by their social surroundings, without exception. And so you can basically influence those things just by creating an atmosphere. It kind of like just changes dynamics. If you don't have set calendar to work with, you can create your own calendar. You can basically arbitrarily create meaning in the world and say, we find this date to be important because of X and Y and Z, and therefore we are going to memorialize that date with some kind of an action or something like that, right? So one example was during the pandemic lockdown, I guess when things were just starting to open up, the oil train campaigners hadn't basically done anything for a year, and because we were all locked down and we were getting really antsy because we were losing our campaigns, things didn't seem like they were going well. And so we had an event on the anniversary of the Mosier train derailment, right? And then we basically like had an event and people showed up, and we marked that as like a start of the resumption of those campaigns. And it's just like, well, that had meaning to us, right? And by sort of like imbuing that with people showing up and doing press and kind of like making that have some kind of legitimacy in those areas, we created that as a starting point and then went from there. And you can do that basically all the time. So sometimes if you're feeling walled in by like process and you sort of feel like you're responding to other people's calendars, or you think you're losing because you're responding to other people's, you can always come up with a creative way to basically like take control of like the timing and the pacing and the rhythm of things. And that can be really important. The key kind of concept around this for me is momentum. Momentum is completely subjective in this world. It's also got a meaning within physics, right? But like in our world, it's just like a feeling. So do you feel like we're gaining power? Does it seem like we're giving power? Are you giving the impression of importance? Like these things are all things that you as a campaigner can do, but with creative action. And I don't know if Damon, if you would agree with this, but I'm not religious and I never have been, but I went to religious schools and I like study religion a lot. And I think about campaigning a lot like my religious friends talk about faith, and like the creation of like an outcome that has not yet existed in reality, and basically just being like, that thing will come, we see it and we move toward that goal, is basically, to me, feels like analogous. And so like when we do stuff here, sometimes I talk about like, well, okay, we're going to climate church, because basically that's what I kind of feel like we're doing. It's like a community of believers who like sees like an outcome that they're moving to. It's a secular outcome, but still it doesn't exist. It's an abstraction. And your goal is more or less to like bring that future into existence using many of the same tools that people have used in community settings for probably thousands of years. And then just the last thing to talk about is doing communications. We at Breach and also at 350, who we share the space with, we've done a few communications trainings in recent days around like Zenith Energy stuff. And we find it very fun. So I'll just say, like, if anybody's ever interested in like an in-depth communications training, we're always happy to do it. But basically the job of doing communications is public figures, especially and elected officials, they have big egos. They really care what is written about them in the newspapers and even like online by people who are shit posting about them, less so than what they care about in the papers for sure. But you can basically like change minds by like applying pressure through the media if you figure out how to use that. And you can stimulate your own media by creative sort of organizing tactics as well. And the most important reason to do communications for me, there's two main reasons. One is to like kind of stir that faith pot that you're working with so that you get people to sort of see through your gaining of legitimacy through the press that this is real, right? Because just having something printed in an article or in a newspaper takes it from like, well, we're just a group of people who care about this issue, but it's private to us, to being like legitimate in the eyes of the world, because the media has like magic, basically. It's like, I mean, it's really stupid if you think about it, that like if I say a quote to my friend, it's like a private conversation that has very little meaning. But if I say a quote to a journalist and they write it down in an article, that's like part of social reality, right? And even in a world where people are critical of the press and like people don't like the press, they don't like and everything, like all that critique, like just like the power of media is still enormous. And it lends legitimacy to your work. So I'll just leave it with the pitch there to invest in communications. It's really, 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 really important. And I'm getting antsy just because I want Damon to talk, but yeah.
I just have one little thing to add. On top of pressuring public figures, it's also really powerful to praise them. Praise goes really far in some of your communications or tactics in general, which I've seen work really well in a lot of scenarios recently.
Yeah, that's
I was
great.
actually thinking of a question very related to that, which is how do you balance like putting pressure on them, maybe through some negativity, but the fact that negativity might cause them to not like you and kind of be more antagonistic, and finding that, how do you find that balance between pressure and positive feelings?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it depends on who you're working with, but like good cop, bad cop kind of dynamics are always useful. It's always useful to have people that are like a little bit more willing to like get their hands dirty and like critique people, and then have other people that are like very nice and like capable of like buttering people up and just like connecting with people level to like even sort of like talk to them about like maybe this is why people are mad, you know, and like I wouldn't say it how they're saying it, of course, or I wouldn't do the thing that they're doing it, but you know, they're opened up to that conversation, right? And so I'll talk about it a little bit later, but there was a really good example of this around like the first campaign that I was ever involved in was trying to defeat a propane export terminal in Portland. And we just like went at the mayor of Portland, Charlie Hales at the time, in like this really intense way. I'll describe it to you in a little bit, but and it was like really effective. It was kind of like, it wasn't mean, it was like silly, but it was like aggressive. It was like really like coming up to the line where in Portland people would maybe start to see it as like something, but it was funny and we were like really whimsical, and so it kind of hit some kind of feeling that it worked. But we tried to move him, and once we moved him, we just made a really intense effort to basically like rehabilitate him, because he wanted to be seen as a climate guy. And we were just like, okay, we've demonstrated power that we're like to be reckoned with, right? Like, you know, because we forced you to change your mind on something that you definitely did not want to change your mind on. And you took a lot of flack from business communities being weak. And then so we just basically turned around, and so the people who were like the nice kind of like people who wanted to do that work went and then kind of rehabilitated that person. And we're like, okay, now that you know what the community is looking for, like, here's how we can work together. And like, honestly, we don't care if you get the credit for the things, like, we just want them to happen. And so like, you know, started kind of like co-building pathways out with that mayor for the next few years while they were still in office. And it worked. We actually got a lot of things done because we were willing to like pivot on that, right? One danger is that you can like go too far in your organizing where it makes that reconciliation difficult, right? Because egos get too burned or people get like criticized too publicly that it's hard for anybody to walk it back and be like, oh yeah, we didn't mean those things when we were like, you're the worst person in the world or something, right? It's just like, so that's something to think about strategically before you like really go after people as well. Yeah.
There's a famous and definitely apocryphal story that didn't happen, but is still true nonetheless, about how when FDR was in office, A. Philip Randolph, the union leader, like came to visit him.
And can you say this louder? Sorry, just so
Oh,
that
sure.
if you go.
A. Philip Randolph, the union leader, came to see Roosevelt and said, you know, and gave his full pitch, and Roosevelt said, you've convinced me, I agree with you, now go make me do it. Which is, I mean, yeah, I think that there's probably a lot of situations where a politician is willing to go along with it, but needs the outside pressure to make it, to give them cover, in order to get where they need to go. So
Yeah. And I mean, you use what resources you have, right? Where you're at in your campaign, and you're always trying to add resources. But if you do have an inside game, like you should use your inside game, right? Like you shouldn't prioritize wanting to be like more aggressive or like really directly going after people if you don't have to do it, because it's hard to come back from. Okay. I'm going to stop here and pass it to Damon Motz-Storey, who graciously battled through traffic to come be with us today in a very busy week too. And Damon's going to tell you about the Portland Clean Energy Fund. So what?
Okay, for the captioning.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you so much, Nick. Hello, I'm Damon Motz-Storey. I'm very glad to be your guest speaker today. This is such an honor to get to talk about some organizing experiences that I've had. So, and actually, you know, this has been kind of an intense week in a couple of different ways for any of us who are like nerds about local policy and politicians and various things like that. It's been a little bit rough for those of us on the like progressive end of the spectrum, as we've been starting to see some of the returns on different races around the state, local, and federal level. But that's, I think, all the more reason to like, I was so ready and looking forward to being able to come speak with you all today, because I think it really is such like a balm and a tonic for, you know, setbacks, moments where things don't happen the way you want to be able to come together with other people who are, you know, passionate about making change and get to talk about some really inspiring and motivating, you know, moments where we were like, oh yeah, but we are capable of amazing things together, right? Like, even when the forces we're up against can be pretty scary sometimes. So it's so good to be with you all. I want to just like give you a little bit of a sense of who I am and build some relationship with you before I dive super much in depth to this. So for the past 8 years or so, I have lived in the Portland area and worked on a variety of different climate and environmental related campaigns. For my first 5 years here in Portland, I was with Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility, which is a sort of health-based climate justice advocacy group, pretty small and scrappy, and a lot of really like passionate and well-aligned nerds who just like really care about public health and doing the right thing. So excellent experience. And while I was employed there, they actually lent me out to the ballot measure campaign to pass the Portland Clean Energy Fund in 2018. So my work life, basically the whole year of 2018, my work life was getting to work on supporting this incredible, never been done before grassroots campaign mobilization for climate justice. And that was pretty life-changing. That was, I have to say, I think like one of the profound honors of my life that I was able to be involved in that in such an in-depth way. Then after my years at Physicians for Social Responsibility, where we also worked on stopping a whole bunch of fossil fuel projects, being a part, I would say, sort of like the public health brick in the thin green line that was keeping a lot of the sort of inner North American fossil fuel reserves from suddenly being exported through Oregon and Washington coastal ports and things like that. So that's some of the other work I did there. then I spent 2 years working on developing the fundraising and communications and narrative strategy programs at the Coalition of Communities of Color, which was another big, deep honor of my career experience, was basically being kind of like invited to help sort of scale up some of the comms and fundraising things that can help that advocacy organization to reach even higher potential, right? Like even greater heights. And so that was a really exciting experience for me, but I was also very clear that it didn't make sense for me as a white person to get comfortable working in an organization that is a really precious, scarce space for racial justice advocates of color to be able to organize with each other, right? It's not my space. So I built some infrastructure there and then helped hire some really amazing folks to take that work over. And then now I'm working with the Oregon chapter of the Sierra Club, which is one of the nation's largest and oldest environmental and conservation-oriented groups. We've been around nationally since 1892, and we've been in Oregon as a chapter since 1978, getting my numbers right. And so, it's been such an interesting experience because, like, I think culturally, that organization is so much better known because of its longevity. But it's particularly well known within a very specific subset of Oregonians, and it tends to be really disproportionately, kind of like middle-aged to older, white, predominantly liberal, outdoors loving in Oregonians. And it may not surprise you to know that we actually have like a really disproportionately huge Sierra Club membership relative to the actual population of the state of Oregon. We have, I think, close to 60,000 people who are either members or active supporters who have taken an action within the past like year or two. And Oregon's a pretty small state. Help me out. I think it's like 4 million roughly. So that's a lot. That's a big membership, especially if you compare that to some of the biggest labor unions in the state. It's an organizing force to be reckoned with, but only if it's really deployed well. That's like currently what my passion is like, I want to actually give it some good infrastructure and make sure that it's really well integrated in with the other climate justice organizations that are out there, because we're lucky in this state to have an unbelievable tapestry of different environmental community groups, groups of professionals that organize around climate and environmental issues of different varieties. And there's so many different coalitions and so many different, we really have a movement of movements of different environmental groups in this state. And we're really fortunate that so many people are so passionate about this issue. It also means that I think that is our greatest strength, but it is also the hardest thing to do, is to actually kind of bring all of those people together and focus people and focus those movements in the same direction at the same time, to be able to shake some of the power structures that we're trying to really change and shift. So that's a little bit about me. I'll also share personally that when I'm not doing organizing work, I also love to ride my bicycle around town and perform in drag shows as my drag alter ego, Desdemona Lisa. Lots of fun, and also an amazing opportunity to make politics something more fun, right? I try to take opportunities in drag to sort of get at some of the actual issues that drive me crazy in my work, but touch them in a little bit more of an artistic and emotional way, right? Because everything that I'm talking about today is very heady and intellectual for the most part. And we are whole complex people that have to experience all of it. So that's, another one of my recommendations to you is, I think you had a great reading from Emma Maris for this class today about the importance of working in community in activism. And I would also add to that and say that art as either a solo or a group practice is a really important piece of, being a climate activist who can really sustain for the long run, whatever that looks like for you. One friend of mine considers cooking to be her art form. And so making sure that she protects time where she's not doing activism work and she's just cooking and able to play with and experiment with recipes, right? Important for her to sustain herself. So just wanted to start with that because who is this person who's up here talking to you? I wanted to give you a little bit more context on that. Then now I want to jump a little bit deeper into what I've been invited to talk about today. And I love that we ordered it the way that we did, where you talked a little bit about what are the different things that you do when you're campaign organizing? What goes into that? What are the different building blocks? Because I think Portland Clean Energy Fund represents this like incredible, like hopeful story that we can feel really proud of as Portlanders and people who live in the Portland area. And it also is an incredible case study. It's a really, really beautiful case study where you can look from sort of the beginning of the campaign to where we are today and kind of plot out these different points that Nick has identified as the sort of the core components of like taking on the big systemic change, right? The kinds of infrastructure that you need to build in order to do some really big systems shifting work. So I'll kind of just like set the stage a little bit. Like let's take ourselves back 10 years into a time machine, back to 2014. And I want to ask you all some questions. What was your life like in 2014? Recall for me what it was like 10 years ago for you, to give me some vignettes of like, what was it like for you? Were you in Portland? Were you somewhere else? You know, what was your life like? I want to hear a few little snapshots. So feel free to just jump in.
I was going to high school.
Going to high school?
Yeah.
Yep. Cool.
Yeah.
Around here, somewhere else?
In California.
In California. Rad. Anybody else?
I was fresh out of college and struggling and failing to find a job in my field. Part of why I moved here.
Love that. Love that. Anybody else?
I was in Los Angeles, and transportation justice was just coming up as like a thing. You know, we were still in like the biking for recreation mode, but now starting to identify issues with transportation and like launching Vision Zero in our city.
Cool. I like that. Anybody else? 10 years ago, what did life look like? All right, we'll move on from it. I guess it would be fair if I also shared that with you. I was in college and I was nearing graduation. And one of the things I was doing in 2014 was working with the Quaker Peace Lobby in Washington, D.C. I was in school in Philadelphia at the time, and I would take caravans of students from the campus that I was at, and I organized them to go down and meet their representatives and senators and get to know the experience of like, oh, any random person can just request a meeting with their representative in Congress and lobby them on something, right? And so this was 2014. This was the Obama administration. It was Obama term 2. And the big talk in Washington, D.C. was whether or not we were going to get a tax on carbon. And that's what we were lobbying for. And it was just going nowhere fast. It was a little bit of a rough time because we had a lot of like momentum around a variety of issues in DC, but a lot of times the big star of the day and the political capital was being spent on other things like the Affordable Care Act. Zoom in on Portland, which, you know, has been sort of consistently in the loop in the 90s and the aughts and like keeps making national headlines for being the first to do cool, quirky, progressive things. Anytime it was sort of put on the map, it was usually for those kinds of things. And in particular, there were all kinds of different sort of green energy, renewable energy, like lots of like green legacy issues that came out of Oregon. You know, this was a famous place where so much tree and forest activism was fomented and refined into an amazing, you know, form of resistance. And this was also the place where, you know, Republican conservationists actually put aside a lot of really important public lands. And so it's always been seen as sort of like the environment is something everybody kind of agrees on in Oregon, right? And so there's a little bit of fertile soil here, you know, quite literally, for some amazing green projects. And so a lot of different renewable energy things are starting to crop up a little bit more. You know, people are starting to actually take the fossil fuel transition a little bit more seriously. A bunch of fossil fuel export proposals are being killed, right? Like they're popping up left, right, and center, but like they're also not going well because there's an amazing social movement in the Northwest that has been organizing to stop them. And it always takes big coalitions of a lot of different community groups. And that's always the recipe for success for that. The biggest problem here that a lot of Portland's communities of color were experiencing was that a lot of these big innovations in green economies and renewables and things like that were not being shared equally or equitably at all. And this was also, I think, the same time when a lot of the sort of like white liberal intellectual class started to like clue ourselves into the fact that, oh yeah, gentrification and racism is really a big problem in Oregon, that the racist roots of this state as a whites only state still perpetuates into the modern day with displacement and gentrification in neighborhoods like the one that we're in right now. And so, you know, that was a moment where there was a bit of an opportunity to, you know, take the vast majority of Portland voters, who are unfortunately approximately like 75% white, to be able to, you know, reconsider a little bit around what is our collective responsibility to try to right some of those inequalities. And so this is the kind of like environment into which Portland Clean Energy Fund organizers started to get together and do some brainstorming. As the story goes, it was 2016 when some of the initial leaders at the NAACP of Portland, at the time that was Joanne Hardesty, went on to be city councilor here. And then, you know, there were also some key leaders at 350.org's chapter, which we are organizing out of here today. And so they started to kind of talk across an aisle that usually wasn't crossed, right? Like, in addition to Oregon being a very white state, the environmental movement in Oregon continues today to be an incredibly predominantly white space, right? Like, unless a group is sort of explicitly organizing under a racial and environmental justice lens, you can probably bet that their membership is really overwhelmingly white if they work on environmental or conservation issues here. And so there was, you know, tension and bad blood in a lot of cases for really good reason between a lot of racial justice advocates and a lot of environmentalists and sort of more traditional conservation-y focused groups. So these conversations were a little tense, right? Like, this was not necessarily always destined to be a harmonious union. And yet people continued to lean into this idea that, you know, there was a little bit of tension around the idea of, okay, should we be maximizing our like greenhouse gas emissions reduction potential out of this measure? Or should we be maximizing things like money for workforce development that specifically targets communities of color, that specifically makes the like good paying union job opportunities that the clean energy transition promises available to the people who are not currently able to take advantage of it? And so, you know, eventually sort of the groups kind of continued to, you know, a few more trusted partners started to be brought in from the, you know, legacy conservation movement that has been so successful on different issues here. And then more racial justice groups started to come to the table. Now State Representative Con Pham brought the Asian Pacific American Network of Oregon to the table. The founder of Verde, the Northeast Portland Environmental Justice Organization, one of the founders of that group, Alan Hippolito, was brought in and kind of talked a little bit about, okay, what could we do here? There was a organizer with the Coalition of Communities of Color, Maggie Talmadge, who is a really brilliant mind on renewable energy and energy systems, who helped to, you know, craft some of the early drafts of the PCEF policy. That's the Portland Clean Energy Fund. That's the acronym. And so those conversations started to, you know, kind of roll forward, and they took a lot of time, right? So it was probably an entire year and then some of just trust building and policy development work, and a lot of meetings, just getting around tables and carefully thinking about, okay, who can we, you know, broaden this circle of trust, like delicate trust, you know, bit by bit, to include more people, because we need to be building more power in order to be able to pull something like this off. That started to proceed again, you know, slowly, bit by bit by bit. But it became really clear that the main objective, the main problem that needed to be solved, is this notion that unless we are very intentional about equity and justice in the transition to renewable energy, it's not going to happen. If we don't have any kind of resources or side rails, we know that the systems of white supremacy and colonialism are just going to perpetuate themselves. It'll just be fossil fuel extraction versus, you know, green energy extraction, right? There's all sorts of ways in which that can still be very unjust. And so this was our sort of way of saying, okay, we got to do something about this here locally. And also, Trump just got elected in Washington, D.C., and there's basically very little that we can count on or depend on coming down to us from Washington, D.C. So we have to grow something from the ground up here. That was like sort of like this, by process of elimination, right? It kind of like underlined the need to do some local action around this. I'm gonna kind of like pause and see like any reactions so far. I'll kind of dig into some more of the different like pieces of the campaign in a bit, but I'm wondering if this is sort of inspiring anything, any sort of reflections that people want to share, just as we sort of set the stage for how did this even come to be?
Question is about
Yeah.
that first year, you know, we heard about how like having wins early is really important, having things you're working toward achieving. How did you like, you know, in that process of building the building agreement and deciding on, you know, what the coalition was going to do, how did you get those wins in that, like kind of having a lot of meetings, or how did you organize the process?
That's such a good question. Oftentimes, when there's multiple different issues all happening at once, it tends to be the same few people that end up kind of coming together to respond to different timely things. And one of the things that was happening kind of parallel with this policy development was Portland started to look at maybe doing a 100% renewable energy commitment as a city. And Portland General Electric, one of our biggest electric utilities, put a proposal on the books to build new methane gas-fired power plants east of the Columbia River Gorge in order to power, you know, electric demand in the Willamette Valley. So those two different things happening prompted a lot of the very same people who were working on developing Portland Clean Energy Fund to work together on things like, okay, what are we going to, how do we define what forms of clean energy actually are the types of clean energy that we want? You know, some are better than others. Let's make sure that we get that into the city of Portland's resolution about what kinds of electricity we want to move to. And then we also had to do a lot of organizing at the same time to stop Portland General Electric from building new fossil fuel power plants in 2017, because we knew we were already having a time of enough of trying to transition our existing power off of fossil fuels. And so luckily, both of those campaigns were very successful, and they also provided like little morsels of trust building for some of these different groups that were working together. And so I think that really helped a lot to kind of give us some of those early victories that were not explicitly what the policy development was about, but they were close enough adjacent to it that I think it kind of helped to make people feel like, all right, we can do big things together. We can trust this. Yeah.
Can I add just like one thing that was interesting about that time was that the coalitions that were kind of like working on PSEP, and it wasn't super public yet, were approaching things from like a very like careful planning. And I would say like the other side of the climate movement, which I was more involved in, were like very strident, and we're like, we have to do all the fucking things, like we're hitting it. And so like some of the tension was also about like making space and like slowing down and like not necessarily like leaning into all the things that like that portion of the movement wanted to do. And like, so a lot of like jostling in like, you know, like good and respectful ways of just being like, how do we like set priorities across like different groups of people that hadn't previously worked together. And so I think those were like, I mean, ultimately it turned out really well, but they were tense at the time, as I recall.
Yes, and even as also plans were starting to take shape for when we would try to launch a signature drive in order to get it onto the ballot, there were some very like sort of relatively more powerful environmental organizations that tried to literally stop it. They tried to like sort of petition these groups to like wait for another year, because at the very same time, these groups were pushing a carbon cap and trade proposal in the Oregon State Legislature, and they were worried that this would pull too much focus and funding away from their efforts in the state capitol to do sort of a market-based emissions reduction program. So fast forward many years and many divisive fights later, that carbon cap and trade proposal never went anywhere, but thank goodness the Portland Clean Energy Fund architects were not dissuaded by that and said, no, we need to be pushing on all the different angles at all the different levels at the same time. So. Okay, so let's get into the next part of it. All of the pieces started to align a little bit more. There were some more funders out there that were starting to put cautious bits of money into some of the nonprofits that were coming around the table here to actually start to build out a campaign plan that could be funded, right? We needed to do a lot of things in order to make this work. The initiative petition process is really cool, but it's also by design meant to be kind of like a high barrier so that we can't just put absolutely every idea onto the ballot. And so we had to get a certain percentage of the electorate to sign an initiative petition, and they had to be registered voters, and they had to write their names and their addresses in a very specific way on very specific paper, only after we got a judge to sign off on the ballot title and the summary of what the ballot, what the initiative would do, and the full text of the actual law itself that was being proposed to voters, right? So we had to work with legal counsel, lots of lawyers in order to kind of figure out what is even allowed for us to do as a city policy passed by voters. And then we had to actually like wait for the courts to sort of approve us for the ballot. What this set up was a very interesting problem and a very like fun problem to solve as a community organizer, which is we're not going to even get the green light to start signature gathering until mid-March of 2018. And then the deadline to gather 34,000 valid signatures, which means you have to gather more than that in order to account for the fact that some of your signatures won't be valid. And that deadline was early July, like by the July 4th holiday. So think about that, like March, spring break, you're not sure whether you can go or not. Suddenly the judge clears it, you can go, you start to print out the special pieces of paper that you do for your signature drive. And then you only have a little less than like basically 3.5 months to gather like tens of thousands of signatures. How would you do that? And I'm genuinely asking you, like, what would you do if you were in that situation? If let's pretend that this room that we're in and the Zoom room as well, we're the ones who are sitting down and going, okay, how do we do this? What's our plan? How do we gather 34,000 valid signatures? Like, does that mean our goal is 34,000? Does that mean we have to set a higher goal? How much higher? And how are we going to do this? What are the best places to go in order to gather these signatures? Who's going to do it? What kinds of things do we need to send them off with? So I've given you some ideas, but like, what is your answer? How would you organize this campaign? What are some broad strokes?
I would start with like structuring the conversation and saying like, okay, how are we going to tell people about this? And why should they care? And then once you have those people, like us in the room, we're all solid on the conversation, then going out and telling everybody else that we know that would go out with us, like go in groups, like 2 people, and just go in really high traffic fruit farmers markets, like grocery stores, and just talk about it with everybody. That's what
Farmers markets, grocery stores, lots of good plans around messaging strategy. It sounds like making sure everybody's kind of like saying the same things, right?
Yeah.
That's awesome. That's great. I love that.
I think you probably want to work backward from your goal, whatever the goal is, to be able to get to the number that will be valid signatures. Like, how many signatures can a person reasonably collect in an hour? How many hours does the average volunteer work in a week? That gives you like how many volunteers are we going to need to get to that, and then kind of sourcing for that number of people.
Absolutely.
I was just going to say, like, going back to Nick's presentation, like doing the power mapping analysis and trying to see the different groups that you could network with or communicate with, and I think each one would have their own unique way of communicating or sending the message out to them, and then from there you can gain some synergy around the messaging.
Hella. Also, there's a comment in the chat, and I'll see. Oh, there's 2 comments in the chat. Thank you. Yeah, this is a great way for Zoom attendees to chime in. So Steen says, I have had people ask me for signatures while on the bus, which seemed effective. Most people seemed more receptive to listening about the issue while on transit versus just walking by on the street or into a store. That's a very good strategy. Yeah. Worth noting as an aside that one of our like lead organizations was Opal Environmental Justice Oregon, which is like famous for doing transit organizing and like doing exactly this, right? So that was absolutely one of the things that we did. And Ben says, it would be important to try and create advocates for your campaign beyond the original founders of the campaign to try and scale up your ability to get the word out and gather signatures. Yeah, right on, Ben. Yeah, those are really great comments. I like that. Anybody else?
I'm in this world right now and it's so hard. We're trying to get community budgeting for all on the ballot. But in today's world, the goal is just over 40,000 signatures to qualify, which means your field plan is going to require 60,000 like signatures just to make up for all the invalid ones. And I like thinking back now in the middle of that struggle. being able to bring more money to the table to fund the field plan early would help you pay for professional signature gatherers on top of your coalition members and organizations who are putting in the work. You're gonna need some professional folks to cover areas that a lot of your supporters can't. And I think to get that goal is hard, and seeing the PSEF story really inspired us to do that. But we know now there's so many ingredients and dynamics that come into play to help you succeed at an initiative petition, which is one of the most popular, if not the most popular, democratic tool for getting something achieved. But I'm curious too, like if you can get into this, did PSEF have the option too to think about a city council moving this forward? Because the initiative petition campaign is expensive. You could also count on a city council making it happen, but the makeup of city council at that time, maybe that wasn't something that felt feasible. So this is the only way to cement it.
That's exactly what happened. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. But basically, like some of the original, advocates here did talk to city council and the mayor at the time, and were stonewalled repeatedly, right? Like just told like this is not, like the mayor didn't like the policy, the mechanism for Portland Clean Energy Fund, which I realize I kind of buried the lead. The policy itself works like this. It's a 1% surcharge using the business license fee that the city charges to businesses that do business in the city. And it applies only to the sales, the Portland-based sales of retailers that make over $1 billion per year in sales. And additionally, they have to make over $500,000 a year in annual sales just in the city of Portland, right? So those two criteria. And then it takes just 1% of those sales in Portland and puts it into a giant fund that has gotten a lot more giant lately, and I'll talk about that later. But that then goes to fund renewable energy projects like rooftop solar and energy efficiency upgrades that make homes more energy efficient. And then workforce development, job training programs, specifically those that prioritize unions are given preference. And then green infrastructure like tree canopy and urban gardens and things like that. In recent years, it's also expanded a little bit to work on things like transportation electrification and starting to decarbonize some of those things. And so that is the actual fundamental mechanism. And at that time, and I would say still today, there were a lot of city leaders that did not want to piss off the wealthy businesses that would be paying this tax. And we have a great question from Nat and the Zoom attendee realm that asks, can we see what companies are paying how much? I could Google, I guess. You actually could not Google this because it's considered proprietary information by the city. And so there is actually an active lawsuit going on right now from Monica Samayoa, the head climate reporter at Oregon Public Broadcasting, is suing the city of Portland, trying to get them to release this exact information about how, like, who's eligible to pay into Portland Clean Energy Fund surcharge and how much are each of these companies paying into it. You can best believe it's probably some familiar names like Amazon, Best Buy, those kinds of like big retailers. So,
do you have a sense of how many companies there are?
I remember the city revenues office saying that it was not a long list. I think it was like fewer than 100. Yeah. But we don't know.
I was gonna say $1
$1
billion.
billion in annual sales is a lot of money. Yeah. So stay tuned on seeing whether that lawsuit resolves.
It's a very like Reaganite position to be like your rights of privacy extend to like corporations' identities of who's paying taxes.
Protecting taxpayers.
Yes.
Yeah, for real. Yeah, so these were the kinds of power structures that meant that city council, because there are multiple ways to get a local city initiative onto the ballot. You can do this expensive and time-intensive and labor-intensive signature gathering campaign, or if you get a majority of the city council to just write it up and vote on it, then it just goes right to the ballot. And that's so much faster and so much simpler. The problem is that they didn't like the policy. It didn't meet their values, and the values were very explicitly grounded in racial and environmental justice and economic justice. And the city council did not see that as worth, angering the people that would have to then pay into it. And so, we would have had to significantly compromise and change the policy into something unrecognizable in order for the city council to pass it through their process. And so that, was not going to fly, right? Because again, like the urgent issue as it faced them, those original architects, was that like we were already feeling how inequitably the green transition was happening. It was already in progress. And this was sort of like a mayday, sound the alarm, like we need to change the trajectory of this. Yeah. And so that is one of the coolest things about the initiative petition process, is that unlike lobbying for a piece of legislation at a different body where you've got elected decision makers who have the power over what the actual policy does, you get direct control to say exactly what your coalition's proposed law change is within the confines of what's legal. And then you don't have to compromise on that at all, right? So that's a huge benefit of going this route, is that you don't then have to like water it down in order to build the buy-in of people who are more powerful than you, right? Like the organizations that individually don't have much power can come together in order to build power to be able to set the policy exactly how the community needs it to be. And that was basically that's the goal. That's the route that we ended up going in with Portland Clean Energy Fund. So amazingly, we somehow managed to raise 62,000 signatures and submit those, which was more than enough to qualify. And so I'm, wishing the same energy and vibes to the participatory budgeting crew. But we did that by doing exactly the things that you all just said, right? Like we had multiple different community-based organizations that were meeting with each other on a weekly and also like a much wider coalition table of people who are endorsing the policy, who met on a monthly basis to get updates and figure out how to plug their staff and their volunteers into different efforts. And there were different like sort of subcommittee areas underneath of our sort of steering committee of like central, leaders from the 11 nonprofits that were sort of the backbone of this initiative. And they were broken down into different areas. So there was a fundraising committee, because bringing in money to be able to do things like paying paid signature gatherers was really important. And then also bringing in money for the actual campaign season to pay for voter information and persuasive advertising. And also, some people who are willing to do paid canvassing even to get the word out about the measure, right? There's a lot of things to pay for in order to do one of these types of campaigns. And then we had a communications committee that was solely focused on exactly what you brought up earlier about how important it is for everybody to have the same message and to also know how to answer the tough questions that different people have about the policy. Like, oh, I don't know how I feel about this. Is it going to make prices go up or something like that? You better have a good answer for that, right? Otherwise, you're not going to build much support when you're having conversations with people. And I think one of the most impressive parts of the campaign that was built was the field campaign. The field team, our field committee, was basically overseeing all of the volunteers and the paid signature gatherers that were going out and doing this canvassing, bringing in the signatures, and then transitioning into getting out the vote and telling people, hey, we made it onto the ballot. Now we need you to vote yes on this. And that was this unbelievably like complicated and like shared, no one person or organization was in charge of any of this. All of it was done by consensus in coalitions where different organizations would send 1 or 2 volunteers or staff to go and like participate in just like a very collaborative, cooperative model of saying, all right, here's what we've all collectively agreed. These are the things that we need to do in order to meet our goals. So who's going to take on how much? And I remember seeing the spreadsheets that we had where it was like, okay, this organization is pledging to get this many signatures, and this organization with this many members is pledging to get this many signatures. And it was this incredible, kind of building block that made a collective action that was really profound, because eventually we got up to the point where we had dozens of neighborhood groups that were involved. We had, even more organizations that were membership-based, labor unions, membership-based environmental organizations like the Sierra Club and 350 PDX that had long lists of people who were really excited to go out and volunteer on something that was so tangible to being able to make change, right? Like having these kinds of conversations with people about saying, hey, you and I, as just regular everyday people, can put something onto the ballot to do something about climate change even though Trump is in office, like making everything worse, like there's something we can do. It was very empowering. It was very like incredible once we actually built up the infrastructure to be able to do this, to be able to give people something so tangible and real and meaningful to do. Which is what made it all the more delicious when we won. So that did happen. And it, I would say, just continued to build like a big groundswell more and more and more. It's like the snowball effect. As the little tiny snowball first starts building in those early years, it took a lot of time and a lot of trust building. Everything moved really slow and carefully. And then as the signature gathering started to kick off, and as we, met milestones and goals and had some interim victories there, we started to really gain some momentum, and suddenly we became the cool kid in town, and a bunch of people started independently coming to our campaign and saying, add me to your list of supporters. I want to be involved with this. I see all these great groups. I see this great project. I want to be involved with it. I want to be associated with it. So that was a really important turning point moment, because basically the only people who were organizing against the measure were representatives of the Portland Business Alliance, our Metro Chamber of Commerce. And so, there was no real credible community opposition to Portland Clean Energy Fund, which is really remarkable, right? And speaks to just the depth of how many different people bought into this idea and went and evangelized for it, right? Like we had at one point actually an entire speakers bureau, and this is a very like important tactic for this kind of a campaign, where we basically had like somebody who would train a room full of people to become trainers and speakers that could then go out and give presentations and pitch people on the idea of joining this coalition and lending a few hours of volunteer support or otherwise to the campaign. So it was this incredible mass mobilization. And we far outstripped all of our projections on how many volunteer signatures we would gather. And I think that tells a very important part of the story, right? It's like, it's one thing for a lot of like dark money groups or very like wealthy, political interests to be able to just like dump money into advertising or dump money into like astroturfing, paid canvassers who can then like try to like make something look like it has community support. But like when you underestimate the potential of volunteers who want to give to your campaign, and they end up like blowing your estimates out of the water, that is telling you that people really believe in this. They care about it. It makes sense to them, and they want to see it happen in the community. And so that, I believe, was the fundamental driving force that was able to make this succeed, right? It's not just the fact that the political circumstances were right for it, and it was like a way for people to kind of get back at the Trump administration and like assert ourselves and our independent power here. But it was also that feeling of like, oh, people who talk about this, you can tell they genuinely are passionate about it and they care about it. So, that is why it was such a remarkable campaign in many different ways. And it didn't hurt that we had such a commanding mandate of the vote, right? It was a 65% yes vote by the time they finished tallying all of the ballots. And that's a 2-to-1 victory, right? And so that was really helpful, because no one had ever done anything quite like this before anywhere, so far as we knew. And that meant that we needed some really strong community support, really big signal of community support, in order to make sure that even after passing at the ballot, the program didn't get picked to pieces by all the people that didn't actually really want to see it succeed in the first place. And that's been kind of the story of the Portland Clean Energy Fund since then, is it has grown beyond something that any of us have any control over, those of us who were campaigning for it in the early days. And it is now so much bigger than any, one individual campaign could possibly entail. And so there are still so many people who didn't want to see it to pass in the first place, who would like to see it undermined and discredited and devalued and delegitimized, so that it eventually can be repealed and those profits can be maximized even further for some of the people that are paying into this. And also recently, it's been so successful at raising revenue because of how much the big corporations have been raking in sales, that it is so successful at a time when so many other revenue streams for vital city services have been dwindling, and a lot of one-time COVID relief federal money packages have been spent up. So these are the very complicated sorts of dynamics surrounding this at this point, and many of the same groups that campaigned for this are now still working on protecting it and making sure that even these different circumstances are not going to prompt somebody to refer a new ballot measure to voters that would ask them to alter this clean energy fund or potentially even repeal it altogether. We're very aware of the fact that that's a very real threat. That could happen. You know, the city council could refer a measure. There are some dubious interests that if they really wanted to get bold, they could put their own initiative petition drive together if they wanted to. These are the sorts of things that we got to be keeping in mind, because Portland Clean Energy Fund is now raising over 7 times what we originally thought it would raise in revenue every year, largely because of things like inflation, corporate price gouging, prices on various consumer goods just going up for all sorts of different reasons. And also because in the pandemic, a lot of people shifted their consumer habits from small mom and pop shops to the kinds of big box stores that were more able to quickly transition to doing curbside delivery and pickup and things like that. And so it meant that there was a big movement of money to those different retailers. And so those are some of the like glimpses of why we are where we at with Portland Clean Energy Fund today. But I think that, you know, in general, this helps to sort of give you a bit of the picture of sort of how we even got here and what were some of, again, going back to Nick's original framing today, what were some of the ways in which we broke down this incredibly big, ambitious, an important initiative that we felt had to be done, and how did we actually like deconstruct it and find the right people to be able to hold all of the different pieces of it so that this big complicated thing could actually move to victory. So that's basically what I have for you. And I wanted to then like reserve the rest of our time together to be able to actually just like get into it and discuss even further. Like we can take it to different areas that that you all are interested in. So yeah. Oh, thanks for reminding me. Oh, Nat also asks, what is a retailer? Well, how is that defined? And is Northwest Natural, the gas utility, included? So retailer was broadly defined as goods and services. So things like all of the things at a grocery store that are not SNAP eligible, not eligible for food stamps, right? Like any kind of like home goods and things like that that you might buy from IKEA, for example, like retailing different furniture or something like that, or like hardware stores or something like that. We explicitly, the measure exempted some different industries. Groceries, medicine, and utilities were all exempted. And so that specifically means Northwest Natural doesn't pay into Portland Clean Energy Fund. And you know, neither do, you know, telephone companies and Wi-Fi providers and electric companies and things like that. And you know, anything that is a grocery or medicine that is being retailed, that does not go into a calculation of whether somebody makes enough money to have to pay into PSEF.
After it passed, didn't they like exempt insurers or something like that too?
Yeah, that was an interesting one where the city attorney's office like interpreted the policy as saying that like insurance counted as a service that was being retailed to people. And the city council did not like that and voted to change that in part because some of the big insurance brokers around town are fairly politically powerful and we're asking for that exemption, kind of saying like, I don't think we think of insurance brokers as retailers per se. And I think there's maybe a little bit of validity to that, but we're not hurting for revenue, so.
Yeah, even prescription medication got excluded. There was a bunch of things from the revenue division that got modified. And even with all those exclusions, like no utility, no medication, the fund, as Damon was talking about, is still massive,
So yeah, it's like roughly $210 million every year.
When the initial estimates were like maybe 10 million.
We thought 30 at most.
Yeah.
Yeah, 30 million at most per year. Yeah. Yeah.
But that could fluctuate. That is exceeded anyone's expectations.
How do you feel about like where the money's going now because of that whole surplus that they had and how they're handling it, the applications, like what are your thoughts on that? And like what was your vision for that, like all the surplus, like what would you do with it? And how do you feel about how they're handling it now?
That's a great question. Thanks for asking it. Yeah, I'll speak for me, but I know that it's also a sentiment that's shared by some of my colleagues in the sort of Friends of Portland Clean Energy Fund space who are trying to defend it. Basically, the mayor is doing some budget jujitsu to like spend some of these dollars on city things that are technically climate things. Things like maintaining the urban tree canopy and transitioning the city's vehicle fleet from gas vehicles to electric vehicles. These do have climate benefits, but it's not really what people envisioned, right? Like people envisioned this as being a community grant making program, and that the primary beneficiaries and recipients should be community groups that want to do community initiatives to be able to take advantage of the green economy, learn about the green economy, get invested and into the workforce for it. And this was not really what we had in mind, right? We didn't have in mind this notion that it would be sort of a supplement of the city's overall general fund, out of which they're supposed to pay for all sorts of city services and things like that. That said, I will say that this feels a lot better than doing something to fundamentally alter the policy itself, right? Because some members of city council have floated the idea of slashing how much we're asking from retailers, right? And therefore bringing in less money. Another commissioner wants to put a cap on it and say, okay, you can get $60 million a year out of PSEF for climate stuff and community benefits, but above that, we'll just throw the rest into the city's general fund and we can spend it on whatever we want. And so those kinds of proposals are real deal breakers for us as community groups that passed this initiative originally. And so what the mayor is doing feels a lot less bad than that, but it also doesn't feel great. It doesn't feel as aligned as it should be with how we want to spend these funds. At the same time, community groups worked really hard on a like in-depth plan for how to spend $750 million worth of PSEF projects over the next 5 years. And like that process has a lot of different opportunities and avenues for community groups to get good funding there. So it's like, it feels to a lot of us, I think, that like, if this is what it takes for us to preserve fundamentally the PSEF program at its core, then we can maybe swallow a little bit of a bitter pill here, especially because it does seem to actually be going towards greenhouse gas emissions reductions and like some things that benefit our communities. But it's just complicated, right? Like it's just the discussion has gotten so big, right? Like it's gotten orders of magnitude more influential than any of us ever thought. And I think there's also an interesting case to be made for like, it can be difficult to spend big sums of money quickly, right? And so that's the other thing is like, how do we actually support some of the community groups that deserve to be getting resource to do this work so that they can receive it and use it, right? And that's I think one of the things that I'd like to see focused on more as we move forward is like an even greater emphasis on building the capacity of awesome Portlanders who really could use these kinds of resources and projects so that we can be getting even more of this surplus revenue out to communities as it was originally intended.
Do you have any specific projects in mind that are pretty awesome that would serve to be a face for this piece of fund and therefore the city council should project it?
Yeah, I'm glad. Yeah, it's good to talk tangibly about like, what is this actually doing? There have been multiple rounds of funding disbursements to community projects, and some of the ones that I personally feel most excited about. I know the African American Alliance for Home Ownership has worked a lot with the Community Energy Project to get PSEF funding to do home energy retrofits and solar panels onto the roofs of Black homeowners who are, in historically Black neighborhoods in Portland, who are struggling in various ways to sort of like build and sustain wealth to be able to stay in the neighborhoods that they've been in for a long period of time. That project is really moving to me. Street Roots, which is such an amazing community organization, received a lot of money to help with some of the physical improvements to their new office space downtown. And so that's, there's big carbon emissions reduction benefits that come with it. Like the carbon footprint of their building and their operation is getting slashed significantly through some of the tech that they're able to buy and retrofit with. And it's also just going to provide better services to the people that they serve. So that's another good example of it. I know that there are some really good projects that work with people who are coming out of mass incarceration, who are seeking opportunities to apprentice into different job training programs and things like that. And there have been some investments in doing that work, right? To be able to kind of connect people with like electrician apprenticeship programs and things like that, that then enable you to do things like solar panel installations someday. So those are some of the kinds of things that have been funded before that feel really cool. And the list goes on and on. Like, you know, we have an esteemed grant making committee member here who could probably come up with a couple of examples too.
Damon named so many of them, but one of the things we hear a lot from critics of PSEP or people who want to see PSEP grow is they ask us, we can't think of one particular project that's like the shining star of PSEP, where people haven't been able to witness or see for themselves what those physical improvements are. So that's been something I would say the city is working on, because people are asking, what has PSEP funded? And can we see it? Can we walk up to it? And, you know, the deep retrofits are important. You'll start to see more of that. The workforce development components and raising the way workers are treated on clean energy projects. There's a lot of deep work to be done in the construction industry with hiring, retention, and treating workers with dignity. There's a lot of abuse that has always happened in that sector, and PSEP is demanding higher expectations, better workforce conditions, and a lot of things are often overlooked in this like green economy. So I look forward to that. You might not be able to see it, but I think when you start talking to people who are impacted by PSEP in that way, I think it's creating generational wealth, dignity, and a lot more joy for people to go to work. So yeah. I want to see a lot of that happen. But there's tons, and I like Damon hit the point really well. It's hard to put all that money out there fast, and city council has critiqued how fast PSEP has been able to put the money out there. City government wasn't initially an authorized recipient of the funds, which just changed early this year. They're receiving hundreds of millions of dollars in a 5-year time span because we loosened up the criteria for being able to do that. But it's still not over. I would tell people to pay attention to city budgeting. Last week, I will say this, I speak for myself and not the committee, but the mayor adopted the budget with city council with PSEP funds built into the adopted budget that the city has not been authorized to get yet.
Oh my God.
So there's some backward stuff happening, but I also recognize as a committee member, as much as I'm hardcore about protecting PSEP for climate and the community, like the implementation of this is gonna have speed bumps, roadblocks, and lots of unintended, unanticipated things because of the political world. But for those of you who really care about this, you have a forum to talk about your concerns about PSEP in ways that Damon can't or that I can't. So really it's your fund. And I think that's the power of passing it by the ballot. It's Portlanders PSEP and not city councils. So I think this is what's exciting about it. But all your questions are so valid, and there's still a lot of things Portlanders want to know about this fund that they can't get from watching one of our 3-hour meetings and watching a city council live stream. So keep asking people. It's really important that you feel ownership over PSEP too.
Well said. Well said.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I mean, first of all, part of the reason why we're like talking about this, it's really important to just like tell the story of the origins of PSEP, just because like if it's talked about, there's like a tendency the further away you get from something to like change the narrative, and that's not happening in a good way right now. It's basically like the people that don't like PSEP are like, oh, there's these like greedy nonprofit people that are just, and it's coded racism, honestly, to be like, Black people are using nonprofits to subsidize their lives. It's basically what's being insinuated by the opponents, and it's being done through coded language. And it's like, it's not true, first of all. And telling the story of how PSEP came together, and the fact that it's still just like a community fund, that sits there to be used as the members of the community decide. Like, you can come up with, like, people like to do nostalgia about old Portland because it was this place where you could come to and it was really cheap, and like you could like start a coffee shop and work for like 3 days and buy a house and shit like that, right?
What is it? The Portland is the city where young people go to retire, right?
Yeah.
That was the adage.
And it's like, well, the market caught up because like the place got popular and became piggy bank for some people and other people were suffering. But like a program like PSEP legitimately allows for people in creative world to be able to do like the types of creative projects that we look back on in nostalgia about, except they just have to have a small clean energy nexus. So like, I remember one of the first projects that I thought was really fun. There was like a yoga studio in Northwest that was like BIPOC serving yoga studio, and they did like some energy retrofits.
They did a green roof too.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it was just like, but their programming was like the centerpiece of it. It was like cultural, awesome programming. And then they're like, oh, by the way, this is like a green building. And like, that's the kind of stuff that you can do with PSEP, like big cultural like projects. And so
Yeah.
I'm, you know, it'd be a shame to let people like get rid of it before we like fully take advantage of it. So
A pet dream that I've had for a while, as just a snapshot of the kinds of things that Nick is talking about. I've had this dream for a while of converting our Sierra Club office in Portland into a kind of a climate resilience hub, put solar panels onto it, get some battery backup in there so that if a power outage happens, you still have power. It could be a warming and a cooling shelter. It's not a giant office. We wouldn't be able to serve that many people at once, but like, hey, power's out, there's a heat wave, you need to come cool off, charge your phone, you could do that, right? Like, I've got this dream of like, what would it look like to be able to do that with maybe some PSEF funds and some partners and things like that. Because that's exactly the kind of thing that we had in mind, is the idea of it has to serve a community social justice purpose. And it also can help us get closer to the climate goals we need to get to. It's not just about that one climate thing. A lot of people have that misconception. It is about both. It has to be both things together.
I have a question for Damon or Nick. You know, with the Green New Deal and offshoots of it, or baby Green New Deals, like why is it that I feel like the public or even government only gives such a short window of time for a program to demonstrate its worth and value, and they want to take it all back? Like, oh, it didn't reduce the temperature in Portland right away, or you know, we're still having.
That's a real thing that Commissioner Renee Gonzalez. Yeah.
Anybody, but there's
I'll go there.
things like that. How much time should we give a program, you know, to succeed or to feel itself out before people say it's a failure? And I think PSEP is only 5 years in, and last year it was like, oh, well, it's not doing what it needs to do. Let's take it all away.
2 of those years were during the pandemic.
During a pandemic.
Yeah.
So how do we stand up for Green New Deal type things and like keep fighting for it when other folks don't give it much time to really flourish?
Yeah. Such a good question. I think it's worth noting that this happens with so many things, right? Like Preschool for All, the Multnomah County initiative, is like being picked to death right now. And Measure 110, the drug decriminalization and like rehabilitation funding measure, right? Picked to pieces by lawmakers in this like reactionary storm of rage and outrage over, you know, what is a very legitimate and horrifying surge in fentanyl and overdose deaths that is not connected to the actual drug decriminalization that we did here. Right. And so like there is such a powerful reactionary force right now that is attacking all of these kinds of progressive initiatives. And I think one of the ways that we can defend best against that is to like continue to tell these stories, right? And to like continue to make sure that people know what is actually happening. And you know, that staying organized with each other, staying connected with each other has been so essential for us to be able to continue to show to city council that if you mess with this, you got to mess with us, right? And so that is one of the things you got to do. And I think that's a broader lesson that progressive movements should take from Portland Clean Energy Fund, is that sadly, unfortunately, you should not really take more than a day or a week of rest after the ballot victory, right? You passed the ballot measure. You made the law different. That's amazing. and you got to like be prepared to stay on it and keep on defending it, because especially if there's an explicit a value statement and a explicit commitment to racial justice and serving communities of color and trying to close the racial wealth gap in any kind of a way, that threatens so many powerful establishment figures, and they will always try to push back on that and always try to undo that.
Yeah, and specifically using the language of like good government or anti-corruption, they do that all over the world because that's how they win liberalism.
Yeah.
And, is that they can separate the liberals and the leftists by using this ginned up, corrupt. Yeah, it's corrupt, it's graft, it's waste. So.
Yeah, well said.
I think there's like the people that are truly against you, or maybe that's a small amount, but there's the rest of the people maybe were for you, maybe voted for this program. And this is, you have to battle like the natural impatience of human beings and instant gratification. Like I voted for it like last week. Why isn't it? Why isn't it going this sort of thing? And I think part of how you do, how you do fight that is with narrative, right? About like celebrating, giving people visibility into the milestones that are happening over time. It's not just like going into a black hole, like all just celebrating all these projects, giving, those people that might be swayed by the like fear mongering insight into the good programs too.
Yeah, and it's no surprise that, I mean, if you haven't read Naomi Klein's Shock Doctrine, it's like the playbook for what has happened in Portland is like, in the basic thesis is that like status quo powers that have existed largely for like the last 40, 50 years, they seek to like build a world in the image of private companies and like investors, and they want to accumulate property at the top and get rid of anything that's basically like a public program. That's their thrust. And the way they do it, because it's not popular, because there's few of them, many of people who benefit from public programs, is to wait till there's a crisis and people are distracted and they're not able to resist, and then basically like sneak through like reforms that are sort of like weakening those public projects. And that's like to a T what happened with all of these programs that we established before the pandemic, or like right as the pandemic was getting started. They stoked like anger and resentment of people, and they waited till people who were like defending those projects were like broken because we like physically had to separate from one another.
Yeah.
We were tired and meeting on Zoom and sick all the time, and then basically started like doing a veiled like anti-tax programs through like sort of like cultural attacks on those. And so now we're a little bit distanced from that and recovering, and we have to like retell the North. We have to reassert basically the will as like a public to want these programs, and like to be able to say, well, how long did we get trickled down economics before we come around? This is like 50 years since we started that. We're still doing that one and waiting to get benefits, but like a public program, wow, it hasn't shifted the whole entire economy within 2 years. It's a failure, obviously, better get rid of it. You have to talk to people and explain how absurd that logic is.
It's why I think the Green New Deal is such a useful framework here. We've often talked about Portland being like a Green New Deal for Portland, right? And the connections are very clear, right? And I think it's exactly this. It's that people are not used to anymore the notion of well-functioning government public services, right? And like that used to be a thing. That used to be a big thing. It's a big thing in Europe still, right? Like my sister moved to Australia and she's got amazing healthcare now, right? So things like that, we're not used to it anymore. And there is such a established, powerful tranche of people who are ready to tear anything like that down because they've been doing it since the Reagan administration. And like what we need to do is be able to model for people like, actually, we can do government public services and we can do it well. And, thankfully, we're also starting to see that other places are starting to join us in that, right? Like the fact that the Sunrise Movement has been able to win the Civilian Climate Conservation Corps from the Biden administration is a huge deal, right? Because that's like a big federal spending program on like a Job Corps for like young people to be able to do stuff that helps with climate change and shit. So that's good. And Nat had a comment here in the chat that I wanted to lift up as well, where he said, I've been thinking that spending PSEF money on Green New Deal projects is good and all, but more broadly, we are taxing big businesses and investing in the community. That alone, outside of the climate justice goals, is novel, right? And I think that's another really important thread to kind of keep in mind here, is that's also part of why it's under such constant attack, is that is dangerous shit for the power establishment as it currently stands. Because it basically sort of offers this tiny little window, this little peek into what our world could look like, right? And what our community could look like if we actually really did move the money from the people who are hoarding it to the people who deserve it, right? And close these gaps that we often talk about closing. We know how much of a threat this is to that power base, because they immediately in 2019, right after we passed PSEF at the ballot, they went to state legislators and they passed a bill. When I say they, I mean like some of the biggest business lobbyists in the state of Oregon immediately got legislators to pass a preemption blocking local jurisdictions from being able to use this exact funding mechanism for any future project. So they basically like closed the door, like slammed the door behind PSEF and said, you can no longer tax the gross receipts of retailers for any initiative. Not climate, social justice, doesn't matter. They just closed that off and like the city of Eugene, there were some people in Eugene who were like already drafting up an initiative petition to try to do it in their community, and they had to abandon those plans because it was taken off the table by it didn't get much press attention either. Like not a lot of people really knew that it was happening, but like that's how much of a threat this is to the establishment.
It snuck into a
student success package.
And so it was like everybody's talking about funding student services, and that was with the big public fight in the Alton building. Yeah, and some lobbyists just like slipped in a preemption and said, we're not going to support this big package unless, we get this preemption, and then, the sausage making, put it in there. So it's like,
Wow,
Does it still stand?
Yep.
yeah.
that's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I had one more question also for the group, which is, and this is good because we're starting to move towards the time when I imagine we want to start wrapping up. But my question for you all is like, what do you feel like other like modern day sort of upstart social movements, or maybe not even upstart social movements, but like what other kinds of organizing scenes could like take and learn lessons from this PSEF story, right? Like what are some of the things that you all think are like pearls of wisdom that should be like held on to and shared beyond this room, right? Like I'm curious to hear what folks' reflections are after we've been talking about this.
Right now, I'm working on a fairless transit campaign with DSA, and like we've been researching since like last year. So I mean, just hearing this story of like how long it took to get PSEF going and how many people it took to like really work it in and make sure that it was gonna work for everyone's interest, and how it really just served to plant those seeds for environmental justice, specifically of bringing in that social justice in with the environmental movement is so important. And just like I think that every environmental campaign or any campaign for justice can learn a lot from that. And like I'm just digging into TriMet's budget, and like I'm looking at somebody, please help me, because like I cannot find, they have $443 million that they have not disclosed. And it's like really crazy to me because it's all public information, and nobody's talking about that. And I'm watching all of their board meetings, and nobody seems to care or know, because there's nobody that's getting paid to look into it, because that's just how the system works, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's crazy that the city is trying to take more money from PSEF when they don't need it, because there's no transparency into where the money's going. They're not even letting us see what PSEF, like how they're even getting the money into PSEF, right? So it's the secrets that they have at the top. They don't want us to know about it, and we need to demand the transparency.
Mm-hmm.
And I can say, like, I didn't know that Street Roots was using PSEF funding, and I live right next to like the office building. So I and I've been like, I love all of the vendors. Every time I see them, I buy like a newspaper and stuff. So I've seen like firsthand what that's done. And I think just having that visibility for like this was funded by PISA for something, like just a sign like out on the in the street is like a huge deal, like to say that like, hey, we're working on this campaign, like inviting people, like regular people to it, because we've all chosen to like come here and spend our time here, but a lot of people don't have that time. So just like making sure that these movements are visible are important. Thank you for sharing your story today.
Oh my gosh, thank you.
Yeah, freeways do a good job. They're like funded by our tax dollars.
Yeah.
Big old freeway.
Right.
Every quarter mile is like a nice blue sign.
I was thinking about the plaque, like all the WPA infrastructure, there's always
Yeah.
a plaque about, you know,
Yeah.
like we celebrate the history of that, but we can do the same thing. for
That's a good idea. I mean, more visible things that say like, this is funded by PISA.
Google Map walking tour where you can do of all the.
I'll tell the
projects.
staff. That's a good idea.
Just in case people want to know the more specifics on that Street Roots project, by the way, it's a plan to renovate the building on Northwest 3rd Avenue, the new building on Burnside Street, that they're moving into. And the grant has allowed them to install solar panels to reduce the carbon footprint, as well as install energy efficiency equipment backed up by a battery should the grid go down in weather disasters. And can install and maintain heating and cooling systems, smoke filtration, so the vendor drop-in space will provide better air to people on the streets during forest fires. Pretty cool.
Useful.
This compound was getting some kind of resources too from PISA. I don't remember,
yeah.
I don't memorize every grant by heart. But I remember this significant compound here has like future plans associated with it. But I think there was something along the lines of creating some kind of community complex where people could borrow office space. You know, a lot of nonprofits and grassroots orgs don't have a home or a base or just like a drop-in place to do more organizing and community work. That to me sounds like a really good use of resources. But there's times, and it's all on the PSEP website, like for every cycle so far, grants of all sizes are listed there if you want to relive some of those proposal packages that we've passed.
You know, I like, one of the things that was fun for me coming out of PSEP was that like the leaders who were involved in that campaign, like some of them became like elected officials, and like it really like lifted up leaders who were like, the person who got elected was a little bit older, but like younger leaders would like sort of like took that as like a next step into leadership and stuff like that. And so it like the confidence aspects, because I remember there were like,
And if you don't mind me interjecting, not just confidence, but a real flex of political power. That was, I think, one of the big things, right? Because when you look at the prime example of what you're talking about, now Representative Con Pham ran for the legislature and swept the endorsements against a known former politician, former Multnomah County chair, and got 86% of the primary vote against him, trounced him, in part because like everybody actually saw that she could like organize. She could actually mount a successful campaign because she had, not just her alone, but her and that coalition had won such a tangible victory that suddenly even the power brokers that didn't like us had to respect us, right? Like it was a big power building move in and of itself because of that. Yeah.
yeah, you said it better than I could.
Sorry to just like.
She's still fighting for PSEP till this day.
She sure is.
She showed up to give her testimony at a recent city council work session because PSEP changes every day, and she helps tell that story from its origins, which PSEP does well. Like I love Damon's take. Every time I hear it, I feel like I was there, even though I wasn't. I only really got involved once it passed. You know, like it became a different beast. But this stuff feels like a lot of joy, a lot of hard work. And
Yeah.
thank you for detailing it for us.
My pleasure. It's a story really worth telling, and it's an honor that I was able to be there for a lot of it, to be able to help tell it. I think we are starting to wrap up though, Nick. Should I pass the proverbial microphone back to you?
Say bye on the line there and then. Yeah, so I'm gonna applaud you because that was
Oh,
great.
thank you.
for that. Yeah, so we've got one more session of this class for number 6 next week, and we're gonna, Cassie Wilson and Aaron Brown are gonna talk to us about transportation and like where sort of like organizers see like policy development coming in the next 6 months to a year. So people are gearing up for some big campaigns that have been in the works for several years now, and now it's time to go. So I think they're gonna like give you some education and hype you up for campaigns that you might get involved in. That one's going to be a remote one by request of the speakers. So we'll do it on Zoom next week. And then I was thinking that we would try to find just like a happy hour time or something. And I'll just send out like a calendar invite to the group and we can see when people can meet. But I think it would be good just like have a end of like, we've been in the space for 6 weeks together, like talking about big ideas. And one of the big goals of like movement education is that like people feel connected and are involved in like campaigns together and are building relationships. And so this is the first time we've done this since like the pandemic has opened up. And so I really want to like hold that and then also like figure out what you all would like to do next or what feels natural to like take momentum from people who want to learn. Cause we're always like 12 to 15 or something in this room here. But then there's another like 60 people that are like either watching or watching the videos afterwards and stuff like that. And so it's a little bit of a community that we've been able to develop. So may as well carry that on forward. So yeah, we'll see you all on the internet and then we'll go from there. Okay, cool.